day, everybody. This is Bob Hoban from Denver, Colorado, and welcome to the Cannabis Insider. As always, with me is Jeffrey Friedland. Jeffrey is joining us from New York City this morning. Jeffrey, good morning.
Hi, Bob. It's great to be here.
We've got a special treat for you today. We're going to speak with Dr. Jeffrey Block, joining us from Southern Florida. Good morning, Dr. Block.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today, and let me set the table for this. Dr. Block is a nationally respected authority in both healthcare and natural earth sciences concerning botanical medicine, education, and research. He's the principal partner of Nurturing Nature Group Consultants and Block Botanical Gardens. He received his bachelor's degree from Emory University, majoring in analytical chemistry with a minor in psychology, and received his medical doctorate from the University of Miami in 1982. Dr. Block is an American board-certified anesthesiologist who additionally is fellowship trained in pain management and addiction medicine. Dr. Block is a popular medical lecturer and has served as the university president of the Miller School of Medicine's Medical Alumni Association. In addition, Dr. Block has consulted and served in an advisory capacity with the Florida state government as it has rolled out its medical marijuana programs and initiatives. Dr. Block, thank you for joining us this morning.
It's my pleasure, Mr. Hoban.
So I'd like to start this morning with this notion that, you know, you're a doctor, but you're also, as I indicated a moment ago, an accomplished plantsman. Does that help you be a better physician?
Absolutely. Before there were physicians and degreed doctors, healers had to know a lot about plants, how to sustain them. If not, they would have certainly failed at their craft, because the formulary of many of the earlier medicines that are still the basis for most modern medicines would have been around in prehistoric times and relied on those healers to know how to sustain them. And maybe as a little inside thought to this, if you were to go to a new doctor to see a doctor for the first time and you're waiting in the waiting room to see the doc, if you observed there a sick or dying plant, how might you feel about that doc?
That's great. That's a great analogy.
Great analogy, and it certainly would, especially in today's day and age with this holistic approach to things, I think it's extraordinarily important to understand where these things combine. Jeff.
Yeah, Dr. Block, we first met, I guess, about 16 months ago, and, I was impressed at the time. I mean, you're a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine, and you teach about endocannabinoid science. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a researcher, but it seems to me that a lot of people seem to make the human endocannabinoid system and its receptors a lot more complicated than they need to be. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's actually a wonderfully complicated system in that it has the ability to affect everything downstream. But the actual body's own endocannabinoid system is really quite simple if you think about it as what's called a little feedback loop, so that as you're confronted with stresses from nature, your body has to make certain adjustments in its what's called physiology, the way it performs. In fact, because right now everybody's focused on neuromovement disorders, epilepsy, different things with mind stresses, PTSD, memory, one of the brightest examples of what I think in the future will reveal itself is, in fact, are those things that keep us in the game when a disease strikes. Because CB2 receptors in particular, which are closer to the immune system down in the abdomen rather than the brain and the nervous system, are there to change the way your body responds to a stress. And in essence then, it's what helps a disease go from something that could kill you outright to being controlled by those changes in our physiology that make that disease become chronic. People die from one disease. On death certificates, there's one disease. But with advanced age, there are actually many diseases that we get that we live with, not die from. It's the endocannabinoid system that makes that possible. And the important point in teaching that is this is the way we're hardwired. It has nothing to do with the plant being out there. In fact, the endocannabinoid system, by nearly 500 million years of evolution, predates even the appearance of the cannabis plant on the earth about 60 million years ago. And there's archaeological evidence of human beings interacting with it 10,000 years ago upon the completion of the last ice age.
Very interesting. Now, Doc, you're a well-trained clinical medical doctor, but you're not a researcher. You're not a researcher discovering new things about, for example, medical marijuana and cannabis science. How does being a clinical physician but not a researcher either benefit you or constrain you in terms of your approach to this plant and the endocannabinoid system?
Well, I'm glad you finished your question with this plant and the endocannabinoid system, because this plant is very unique for its history with human beings. And in fact, since the end of the Ice Age I just mentioned, human beings brought the plant around with us throughout the world. Unlike other plants which have different ways of propagating and spreading itself because it's existentially rooted, it can't flee stresses, it worked away with human beings so that through human agriculture, we took the plant around the world with us over those 10,000 years. The reason that's important is because that would seem to suggest that it doesn't work too unfavorably with our genes. That in of itself is evidence that this plant is actually kind of different than most others. And in that sense, getting back to the root of your question, this plant is researched, and researchers, of course, are fond of working with lab animals as due protocol. I don't really know if I care too much about what this plant does to a lab rat, because there's that much evidence that's awaiting clinical confirmation of what it does to human beings. In fact, Raphael Mechoulam, widely regarded as the father of cannabinoid medicine, always states that, well, he's not a clinician, but these findings that have been coming about over the last quarter century or so, since the discovery of how everything works within the body, are really lacking that one critical thing, human clinical trials. So while I have many fine colleagues who are researchers, for this particular subject, I value being a clinician who understands what drugs do to human beings' health and behavior.
That's really interesting. Bob and I, on past programs, have spent a lot of time, Doctor, discussing policy, because obviously policy here in the United States and then the federal versus states is, at best a mess. Doctor, what are your thoughts regarding ethics and the U.S. position on cannabis prohibition as we're, here in the last quarter of 2017?
My thoughts are about impressing the importance of education, because yes, we're 2017, and we can go back 25 years ago to what I just mentioned a moment ago, was when the discovery that cannabis works through a receptor system was first realized. That was a very powerful moment, a watershed moment for the science involved, because then it gave us the ability to understand the human body and how cannabis works by mimicking what's actually within us. So in terms of the education of doctors versus the legislators versus my patients, I have a problem when my citizen patients come to me with intelligent questions, and many of my colleagues are not yet educated enough about this particular system to know how it works and to offer their educated response to those questions. So in fact then, in 2017, if I look at prohibition in terms of simply saying, does it have any known uses for healthcare? Is there any evidence-based data to support its use that way? Yes, in 2017 there are several things, but three in particular that were noted through the National Institutes of Health, through the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's report in January. It seems to be very effective for the nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy, for the muscle spasms associated with multiple sclerosis, And finally, for pain, chronic pain in particular, the details of which have yet to be fully elucidated, but there absolutely are known uses. Other definitions and criteria for its remaining prohibited, which in fact does stifle education and research, includes the fact that cannabis should then also be noted to have a high potential for abuse. Well, that's a very relative word. We see outside in 2017 horrible outcomes with respect to substances that have considerably higher potential for abuse, opiates, synthetic and otherwise, benzodiazepines, Valium. Other medicines certainly have a high potential for abuse too, and probably higher than the dependence rate on cannabis, which is generally cited around 10% of all users are dependent. So those are two things, just commenting on the actual rules of what classify this as a prohibited Schedule I substance. The third being a lack of accepted safety under medical use in the United States. Well, that's true because it in fact hasn't been able to be used because of the constraints of prohibition on research, number one. And unfortunately, everybody talks about the constraints of prohibition on research, but forget about education at large. Medical schools generally teach students according to what they need to learn, such that when they graduate medical school, they have an MD, a medical doctorate degree. And in fact, though, to practice medicine in any state, you need to pass what are called the National Board Examinations, which is the national standard that way. Cannabis being a prohibited substance, generally questions about it in the endocannabinoid system are not approached and asked on that national board exam. So why would good qualified educators spend the time and capital on educating students on something they're not going to be asked about on those examinations? So in fact, prohibition itself acts to undermine education as well as research. And that's a very slippery slope, because before the Controlled Substance Act, you can go back to 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, when the AMA came out and said they are not in favor of that type of legislation, particularly if it undermines education and research. And so from way back then, there's been a conscientious objection on the part of, in this case, organized medicine, the American Medical Association. But now we're 2 full generations of doctors later, and now we know the mechanism of action of how it works over the last 25 years. Well, why is that important? Probably because when doctors learn something, we tend to ingrain in our practice that knowledge that we were taught and build on. And in fact, a young medical student eager, a sponge to learn about the current mechanism of action, physiology, and what it works for, that's someone who can grasp the concepts easily. In fact, it's a little harder for someone to unlearn something that they've been taught their whole career.
Well said. Now, Dr. Block, you've been known for being a bit constrained as it relates to providing interviews, but I recently read an editorial opinion regarding legislating for better patient outcomes. That was published online in May of this year. Why did you decide to address this issue, the idea of legislating patient outcomes? Why is that such a critical issue in this industry?
That's a great consideration. Thanks for bringing that up, Mr. Hoban. The reason that I wanted to pen that when I did is, first of all, I felt it was very important to not give an interview and have a certain sentence or something extracted and then publicized in the interest of the viewership or readership. The full picture is not only complicated, but it deserves a balanced answer. And all balanced answers in medicine are based on patient outcome. In fact, patient outcome is one thing that legislators have not yet really addressed, because if they did, they would look at the current science of those things that influence patient outcome. For instance, we know now pretty well for the last several years that the influence of different cannabis varietals, when taken in, have a considerable effect based on the terpene content, and yet most people are only approaching the plant itself from primarily the component THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, as well as now, more recently, CBD, cannabidiol. Well, those are only 2 of the principal cannabinoids, although probably the most important two that we know of. However, once combined with the terpenes, the user's effect could be tremendously different from one varietal to the next. So when we have legislators basically saying which plant chemicals can be used, and in particular to treat which diseases, the last time I looked, that was called the practice of medicine, and yet it's being legislated by non-trained physicians. So issues such as mandatory reporting or revealing of terpenes become a very valid discussion for the benefit of physicians authorizing patients to receive it, as well as for the information the patients themselves deserve to know. Unfortunately, you have a mindset with certain varietals that one varietal, we like the effect better, so we'll keep it as an intellectual property, and I'm glad we don't have to reveal everything that's in it. Well, that may be an industry's nascent idea of how cannabis works if it's truly just a recreational commodity, but as a healthcare tool, as an actual medicine, revealing that becomes very different than considering it as like a hamburger's secret sauce, which we don't have to tell. The full disclosure of what's actually in the medicine is very helpful to promote better patient outcome. There are other things, though, that come up in terms of promoting better patient outcome, and they have to deal with all healthcare entities do not simply work on a paradigm of what's called quality assurance. Quality assurance is one of the wonderful things that industries brought into the manufacturing of cleaner plants that are using less chemicals and more of a natural final product. And certainly that's of benefit compared to the traditional black market materials that might have been accessed. However, at the same time, besides the chemical components or what are actually in the plants, making that information available to the doctors and patients is key. The patient outcome issues, though, then become one of not only the chemical materials that are in there, but of what's a different paradigm called quality improvement. Because quality improvement, or what is otherwise called continuous quality improvement, abbreviated CQI, look at bad patient outcomes, negative patient outcomes, and they use that information to retool the product to make it safer and more effective. That hasn't quite yet hit the cannabis arena, industry, nor legislation, but legislating for continuous quality improvement is important. And how could that be done? Well, everybody in the United States so far, moving state to state, have been occupied with wanting to get a license to manufacture or separate chemicals or dispense. Those licenses should have certain parameters for performance concerning their renewal, such that entities and companies that practice continuous quality improvement metrics are going to be adding to the field as those, unfortunately, bad outcomes occur. And there will be, there sort of have to be, because that's the discovery and learning process. So continuous quality improvement is another thing that could be worked into effective legislation to promote better outcome. And I hope that gives you two items from which we can approach this field differently than it's been done thus far.
Yeah, Dr. Block, it's such a unique pleasure to speak to someone not only who's a medical doctor, anesthesiologist, but an awarded horticulturist and visionary as it relates to this whole cannabis industry. What's in store, Doctor, for the future of the cannabis plant as we know it today?
Well, to take a little bit of the wind out of the sails of that question initially, what's really in store for the distant future may not be anything about the plant itself at all. It might be about how to manipulate the body's own, what we call endogenous chemicals we have. With an endocannabinoid system, this is sort of on a parallel with what was discovered in 1975, that we also have an endorphin system, or if the word morphine, endorphin system, a plant there also identified a receptor system. So the future, in fact, may be less about the plant than you realize. However, one of the things that I find exciting as a horticulturist are the ways that plants now can start to reveal those varietals that may have been long lost from decades, if not centuries ago. There are fields that are existing in very few places in the world called landrace, Landrace, landrace fields. And these are areas where cannabis has been grown for decades, if not hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years. And the influences that the plants in that particular landrace place might be would be influences of both its environment, meaning is it going to be in a dry environment, wet place, is there a certain animal or insect that might attack it, as well as influences of the cultures that are using it, such that those plants that are being used by certain cultures would likely work favorably with that particular culture's genetic makeup. Remember, this is a plant that 10,000 years ago has been traced to have started back in Asia, off of the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, working its way down through the Indian subcontinent, a different peoples, then not only there, but through Africa, up through Europe, before coming to the New World only about 500 years ago with the discovery of the New World. So as it's worked its way around the world, there have been different cultures of people who have used their particular varietals or landrace plants to their benefit, genetic benefit. Well, if we have the ability now to look at the plant's genetic makeup and match it to which peoples many, many centuries ago may have derived the best benefits from it, that's exciting. If you're thinking about a comparison, you probably have heard of like heirloom fruits, tomatoes or strawberries that have a taste that's long lost after we've started to hybridize to make it have a better shelf life in the supermarket. Well, recreating some of those cannabis varietals is actually very exciting, because conceivably that could reveal particular plants that work better for particular patients. And then you've come to the core of what is really truly the holy grail, not of the plant, but of medicine. It's called personalized medicine. It means that a given medicine will work for that particular patient. One of the problems we have is if I gave you a blood pressure medicine and I took it and someone else took it, we may respond differently to that particular medicine. It has to deal that they're not personalized to work optimally with our genetic background. Cannabis, on the other hand, because it has evolved in different places of the world, may in fact reveal certain varietals that work more efficiently and to better outcome with one genetic component patient versus another. That to me is an exciting possible way that we're going to start to look and find what may in fact be the holy grail for one culture's cannabis varietal versus another.
Well said, Doctor. I tell you what, it really sounds like what's old is new again. And with education, research, and scientific approach to this plant, perhaps we can advance our collective knowledge about the endocannabinoid system and this plant as this industry evolves. So we'd like to thank you sincerely for joining us this morning. Learned so much in just a short period of time. I'd like to thank my partner, Jeff Friedland, and thank everyone for checking out Cannabis Insider. Please take a look at cannabisinsider.tv, and we will see you next time. Thanks again, Dr. Block.
Thank you, gentlemen.